Welcome to the webinar Succeeding with Forecast Pro. Today we're going to discuss new product forecasting. Hello, my name is Franklin Rea. I'm a senior trainer here at Forecast Pro and I've been with the company about 2 years. I frequently speak at our conferences and special events. A little housekeeping about today's webinar. Our webinar series Succeeding with Forecast Pro runs every quarter. The next installment will run in August and be about overrides. And when we finish today, the webinar will be uploaded to the YouTube channel. Throughout today's webinar, if you have questions, please use the chat functionality in Zoom to ask them. My colleague James is standing by and will collect all the questions to be answered at the end. We'll spend the last 10 minutes of this session going over any questions that folks have. Now, let's discuss the structure of today's webinar. First, we'll give an overview of the new products topic, and then we'll go through a lot of examples using Forecast Pro. We'll wrap everything up with some conclusions, and then we'll move on to questions at the end. What we find is that most Forecast Pro users deal with new products in some way or another. And expert selection, which is the model selection process that Forecast Pro uses to choose the best possible statistical modeling technique for each of your items, relies on the presence of hopefully long and stable historic data, which means that new products, which by definition have little to no history, can't avail themselves of this. And this ends up being one of the major points of forecast error. I've been saying new products a lot, but we understand that everyone's Forecast Pro project is different. So when I say a new product, I might mean a literal new SKU, but I might also mean a new customer or product family or region or really anything depending on how your project is structured. We're going to look at several examples using Forecast Pro today. The first of these is just what techniques are available in Forecast Pro to forecast new products. And we're going to focus on a couple of these. The first one being item mapping, also called item supersession. We're also going to look at some alternate techniques like forecasting by analogy and custom component models. Then, after we've learned about that, we're going to switch gears to talk about how new products get added to your project in the first place. This might be through a routine data pull, but we're going to showcase an alternate technique, in which case a new product list is maintained in Excel separate from the main historic data, and demonstrate why this is an easy way to maintain control of new products as they enter your project. Finally, we're going to wrap up by talking about the item life cycle. So this would be how to monitor your new products as they mature. Items that come into your project for the first time are not going to be new forever. Eventually their history will extend as new actuals roll in. And we want to be able to monitor these in the most useful possible way. So we'll talk about using the item report and custom layouts to keep track of our products as they go from completely new to well-established items. There are essentially two approaches we can take. New products have little to no history. Of course, we know that we build the model based on the history of an item, so we can solve this issue by either supplementing the history of the new item or impacting the forecast directly. And I'll give you some examples of those. On the one hand, we might just want to find history for an item directly. Here's what this would look like. This is an item with only one period of history, so clearly very new. And it's getting a flat line forecast, just a moving average. However, we may determine that this item is really a continuation of an existing item that's been in our project for some time. For instance, something that got recategorized or reskewed. And if that's the case, we could take the longer, more stable history of the existing item and attach it to our new item and use that as forecast history to build a forecast for the new item based on the history of the item that it superseded. Then, even though we only have one data point of actual history for the new item, we're building its forecast based on the history of another item, and this will allow us to apply a more sophisticated model. Let me show you an example of this in Forecast Pro. So here we are in Forecast Pro, and as you can see pulled up on the screen, I have an item with only 2 periods of history. Now, just a couple things about this project. We are looking at shipments of various types of gloves to distributors. So our hierarchy starts with a grand total, and then goes down to geography, and then product type, and then SKU, and finally the item level is the distributor. And as you can see here, the item that we have highlighted is a distributor that's only been active for 2 periods. But what we're going to do is map history onto this distributor from a pre-existing distributor that has a longer, more stable history behind it. That is this one. Now you can see both distributors are Home Crate and Harbor, but the initial one is the new product, and the other one we're looking at has a long, stable history going back several years. The way we do this is we select our new item, and then we're going to go to the Forecasting tab, and then we're going to choose the Product Mapping dialog. When we choose the Product Mapping dialog, we see that in the top section we have what we want to map to, and this should be our new item. And then below that we have Map From. This is where we'll select our pre-existing item that we want to copy the history from. Now, because the items I'm concerned with are here in my hot list, I'm going to filter this down to the hot list, and I'm going to choose exactly the one we mentioned. And when I select that, you can see the graph in the background here change. And in fact, what we get here, if I move this window out of the way, is a proposed forecast history. That is the history of the existing item in yellow overlaid with the short series in green, if you can see it here, of our new item and how they would attach. Now, there are some settings I can play with. For instance, we have this one called allocation percentage. This comes into play if the history that I'm mapping onto my new item is too high. For instance, we can see that the proposed forecast history in yellow is a mismatch for where my new item launched. So I could choose maybe only 25% of that history, and then they get a little closer. I could also choose how much of the history I want to bring on by selecting a date range for the history of my existing item. I won't do that here. I'm just going to press commit so that we can see what happens. When I do that, the history of the existing item is now attached as forecast history for my new item, and we can see they're both here. The actuals of my new item, which only cover 2 periods, as well as the full forecast history of the pre-existing item in blue. And it's that forecast history that we're using to generate the model. And it should be very clear here that we're no longer forecasting just a flat line, but are able to take advantage of a much more sophisticated model that is already calculating things like seasonal pattern. Now, not every new product is a supersession or a continuation of a pre-existing item like this. So I'm going to show you a couple other techniques that allow us to forecast new products without impacting the history directly. The first technique I'll show you is what's called building a custom component model. So here, as you can see, I have another new item. It has 3 periods of history, and it's still getting a completely flat forecast. Now, earlier in the slides, we talked about how forecasting new products amounts to solving the problem that new products don't have a lot of history to begin with. And we can solve that in one of 2 ways. Either we can find some history for them, or we can impact the model directly. What we just saw a moment ago was an example of finding some history for a new item. For these upcoming examples, we're going to impact the models directly. Notice that this item is the Cargo Oasis distributor for a given SKU. And see that right below this on the hot list, I have another copy of Cargo Oasis for another SKU that has a much longer and richer history and clear seasonal pattern. The technique I'm about to demonstrate will allow us to copy the model parameters that were used to build this model based off of this history and bring them onto our new item, even though the new item didn't have much history to speak of. The way I'm going to do this is go up to our new product section in the forecasting tab and choose custom component model. And when I do that, noting that I have my well-established product selected, we can see that it has seasonal indices that measure its seasonal pattern in the history and in the model. And by going here and switching this setting to custom, I'm actually able to save these. And I could modify them if I wanted to. For instance, we see January is 1.03, which means an average January for this item should be 3% higher than expected. And February is 0.95, so it should be 5% lower than expected, and so on and so forth. We could modify these if we wanted to impose our own pattern, but I'm just going to keep them as is and press OK. But we're going to give these a name by choosing Save As and typing in Cargo Oasis Seasonal Pattern, which is the name of the item we're looking at. And when I save that, I can cancel out of here and I can go back to my new item. Remember, also a Cargo Oasis distributor just under a different SKU that has next to no history. And we're going to forecast it as if it has the model parameters of the item we just looked at by going back to our custom component model and choosing from the drop-down the Cargo Oasis with the seasonal pattern. And by doing so, we load those seasonal indices into this section here to become the seasonal indices for our new item. Then by pressing OK, we apply that model specification, and even though we have only a small amount of history, we're able to copy over the seasonal pattern, aka the model parameters, from the pre-existing item. Now, there is one third way we can approach new product forecasting, and this is called forecasting by analogy. This is a little different than borrowing the model parameters like we just saw. And to do this example, I'm going to go to yet another item that I have. And this one is a distributor called Home Crate and Harbor. And what we're going to look at is not the model that it has, but its launch profile. That is how it looked when it was launching for the first time. We can see we have this large initial buy-in, and then it cooled off, and then its seasonal pattern took over. Oftentimes with new products, we know that they are in some way analogous to existing products that we've been forecasting forever. And we know that when they launch for the first time, their launch shape should look similar to products that we understand very well. So here, we're not going to borrow the model parameters. We're going to borrow the launch profile of this item, that is this early part of the history. And to accomplish this, I'm going to create something called a helper variable. I'm going to go up here and press Create Helper. And we're going to select the forecast history. That's the default. And we're going to save this as Home Crate and Harbor launch profile. And when I press OK, this historic pattern is now saved to motivate the forecast of one of my new items. Now, what new item am I going to look at? It's also a Home Crate and Harbor item. But again, this one with only 3 periods of history under a very different SKU. And to forecast this analogously to the item we just looked at, I'm going to go again to my new product section of my forecasting tab and choose by analogy. And we can see the helper variable we created is right here. This is the Home Crate and Harbor launch profile from the other item. And you can see if I drag this window out of the way, if I immediately click apply, what we're going to get is the launch shape of that other item used to model the launch of this item. Now there are some settings I can take advantage of. For instance, I can specify the launch total and launch horizon. I can say that instead of calculating the volume of this item based on the couple of data points I have, I can specify how many units I'm going to push out into the market. Maybe I want to push 6,000 units out, and maybe I want to do that over the next year or 12 periods. When I make these choices and reapply the model, we'll see we get sort of the same thing, except the volume is just higher relative to our starting point. Another setting I can choose is this one right here, Expert Selection After. When I check this box and select a date here, it will instruct Forecast Pro to run the normal expert selection model selection technique after this date. because we know eventually this item will continue accruing history and transition from being brand new to well established itself. And at some point, it will be able to support a model on the basis of its own data rather than just by analogy to another item. So we can specify for how long we want to use this forecasting by analogy technique before we want normal model selection to take over. So just to recap, the main issue with forecasting new products is that they don't have a lot of history on their own, and we need history to build a good model. Now we can solve that problem one of two ways. We can either borrow the history directly from another item, as we did with item supersession, aka product mapping, or we can cut out that middle step and just impact the model directly, either using a custom component model by borrowing the model parameters from something that already has a good pattern on it, or by using forecasting by analogy to borrow the launch profile from an item that we already understand. And we looked at examples of each of those. Now I want to switch gears and talk about how we might add new products to our project in the first place. In a typical setup, it's common that all of the data that's coming into a Forecast Pro project is coming from a database, maybe directly, maybe in an intermediate way using an Excel sheet. This would include our regular items as well as our new items. We understand, however, that some users need to start planning forecasts for new items before they end up in the historic data. And thinking about it another way, that sometimes the historic actuals are generated from a data pull from a system that's not controlled by you, the forecaster, because it's tied to a shipping or billing system that's managed by IT or sales operations and is only measuring items that have actuals attached to them. So for instance, if you wanted to get ahead of modeling new items that had no sales or no shipments at all, not only would those new items not show up in your typical data pull, but also it might be impossible for you to insert them, especially if you're using something like a direct connection. To get around this, I'm going to demonstrate an alternate approach, in which case our normal historic data still comes from our data pull, but our new items are maintained in a separate Excel spreadsheet that we attach to Forecast Pro. So here we are back in Forecast Pro, and again, this is our gloves project. And you can see for our product types that we have several common types of gloves like cut resistant, leather palm, natural cotton, neoprene, rubber insulated, and wire mesh. Furthermore, this data is coming in through the data manager via an ODBC connection, that is a connection directly to a database. So let's imagine that I have no control over what is in this data pull, and if I want to model items that are not in this database pull, I would have to bring them in another way. I'm going to do just that in the way we described. I'm going to add another file under historic data using Excel, and the file I'm going to add is going to contain a new type of product. Now, as you can see, when I attach this Excel sheet, it's going to stack right next to our regular data pull. And before I refresh everything, I'm going to show you what this file looks like. So this is the file I just added, and as you can see, it contains two new product lines. We have our hierarchy here in blue, and you can see that in column C, we have product lines for premium welding and basic nylon gloves that were not in the project before, along with their own new SKUs. This file, however, looks identical to a normal Forecast Pro historic data file, including the description column and calendar setup, except that instead of a lot of historic data, we're just going to maintain one column. So right now it's May, which means April just closed. And it turns out for a few of these, I do want to include some actuals, but for the majority of them, I'm fine with them just being blank because some of these items are coming in completely new with no history at all. And when we load this file, Forecast Pro will be fine with that. So now I'm going to hit read and forecast. And having done that, we now notice that our new items, basic nylon and premium welding, are both slotted into our hierarchy. Now, recalling the file, it was the basic nylon gloves that had no history to speak of, and indeed we've loaded those as if there are no historic actuals at all. But we can start forecasting them ourselves using the override grid. Meanwhile, our premium welding gloves did have one period of historic actuals attached to at least some of them, and these would be a perfect candidate for some of the modeling methods we discussed earlier, like custom component or forecasting by analogy modeling. Let's see this example one more time, but along a different dimension. The first time around, I added a file that introduced 2 new product lines to our project. Now I'm going to add a file that introduces a new distributor. So again, just checking, we can see that our existing distributors are Cargo Oasis, Home Crate and Harbor, ProLink, Urban Goods, and Vitality Distribution. And I'm going to go back to Data Manager, and let's stack another Excel file into our historic data. This one is going to be called Gloves New Distributor, and it will add a new end item. Again, we see the stacks with our other inputs. And before I refresh the project, I'll show you this file too. Just like before, we have our hierarchy, except now we have a new end item. That is a new distributor called Green Tree Holdings that we didn't see before. And then we have our description column and calendar information. And this time around, I actually don't have any actuals to speak of. This Green Tree Holdings distributor has never worked with our products before, so we have no actuals behind them, and we're just going to leave that column for the previous month blank. But when I load this, everything will be fine. So let's again refresh. And you can see that when I drill into my product lines like cut-resistant gloves, for each SKU, I now have the previous distributors as well as the new Green Tree Holdings that has no data because that's the way we set the file up. And because that file included a copy of Green Tree Holdings for each of our SKUs, it appears basically everywhere that it needs to in the project. But this is a perfect opportunity to model it using the override grid. So if you as a Forecast Pro user frequently need to model items that aren't coming in with your normal historic data pull, it is possible to load them through separate Excel sheets in the Data Manager and get ahead of that forecasting and planning, managing them by exception, and then allowing them to drop off those Excel sheets when real historic actuals roll in and those items show up in your standard data pull. So the last topic I want to cover today is the new product lifecycle. Because new products don't have much history, we want to be sensitive to which models they can support. And a helpful way to do this is to think of them in phases. For instance, our phase 1 items are those with only 0 to 1 month of history, similar to those that we saw attached to our project a moment ago using a special Excel sheet. But over time, these items are going to start to accrue real history. Between 2 to 11 months, they're still pretty new, and we'll want to continue our new product modeling techniques that we discussed. Although at 12 months and after, machine learning modeling can be applied for the first time, and this would be phase 3. After that, in phase 4, covering 18 to 23 months, seasonal exponential smoothing can be applied. That means that even if our exponential smoothing model doesn't choose a seasonal pattern automatically, we can ask it to. And if you want to think why this is true, 18 months is the same as 12 plus 6, which means we have a whole year of history and then at least half or more than half of another year, which means we can start making month-over-month comparisons that give us a meaningful seasonal calculation. Finally, in phase 5, when we have over 24 months or 2 years of data, all models are going to become available, and then our products are considered well established. Oftentimes, the best way to keep track of these phases is using the item report. So I'll go to the Reports tab in Forecast Pro and choose the item report right here. And expanding it, we can see right after our hierarchy, we have this column N, which stands for number of periods of history. Now I can filter that maybe to include our 0 to 1 periods of history items. This would be our phase 1. And then save these as a layout by going to the Home tab and pressing Add Layout. And we'll call these phase 1 items. Maybe skipping ahead, I'll refilter to our phase 3 items. These were 18 to 23 months of history. Then I'll save a layout of this view as phase 3 items. Now what these layouts are doing is saving not only what's on my screen, but also the filters that are applied. And these filters are dynamic, which means not only when I'm looking at something like my phase 3 items layout, if I choose the phase 1 items layout, will the report snap back to not being 18 to 23 anymore, but being 0 or 1. But also, as my historic data file gets updated, and say, for instance, this item moves beyond 0 or 1 periods of history and has, say, 2 or 3 or 4 periods of history, it will drop off this list. So through intelligent use of layouts, I can manage each phase of my product's life cycles. Let's go back to our phase 3 items. These are the ones that can support seasonal patterns for the first time. And a few columns over, we can see that exponential smoothing has been chosen for a number of these. So for instance, if I bring up the graph and choose this first item, even though seasonality has not been detected directly, if I go into my forecasting tab, I could choose a model that forces a seasonal pattern onto this item. But I'm going to show you one more little trick. Let's talk for a moment about machine learning. I actually had machine learning turned off for this project because of computational time, but there is a way to turn it on selectively just for subsets of our hierarchy, not all our items globally. To do that, I'm going to grab these items in our list, which were our phase 3 items, and I'm going to move them into the hot list. And choosing just one of these, I'm going to go to the forecasting tab, and I'm going to select under machine learning what's called expert with machine learning, which means we're going to run expert selection with machine learning as a candidate just for this one item. And we pick up this modifier called /MLES. Now, I'm able to take this modifier and apply it to everything in the hot list, which again is just our phase 3 items, which we know are past the point where they're candidates for machine learning as a model. So I'm going to select Apply Modifiers to Hot List. And that will run expert selection with machine learning under consideration just for this smaller subset of our items. And then we can walk through and review where machine learning was chosen. So using a combination of the item report, your layouts, and the hot list to segment parts of your project and apply models either individually or in bulk as needed is very convenient for managing the life cycle of an item all the way from when it's very new until it has a long time series of history behind it. To tie everything together, the purpose of today's webinar is to address the fact that the majority of companies deal with new products. And as we discussed, you can address new products through a number of ways, either through manipulating the history or by directly adjusting the forecast. And as we also discussed, it's important to monitor new products as they mature from brand new to well-established products over their life cycle. As we brought up at the beginning, our next webinar will be in August, and we'll discuss overrides. If you'd like to sign up for the August webinar, James will be posting the link in the chat right now. Speaking of the chat, we're about to go to Q&A, so if you haven't posted your question in the chat yet, please do so now.